Unplugged. Raw, real, and unplugged answers to all of your psychic, spiritual, and paranormal questions. Hosted by me, professional psychic medium Allison Boswell, and my sometimes skeptical sidekick Nick.
We're back. It's been a while. We haven't been behind the mic for a few weeks, a few months.
Yeah, maybe a couple of months.
We've taken some much needed time off for my busy event show schedule, and I'm super excited to be back with this particular episode that we have going.
And why don't you tell us what we have, Allison?
Well, we're going to be starting our special Halloween double feature with another of our it's become fairly popular, spirited pop culture segments, this time about the Amityville Horror movie from 2005.
And what did we do while we were watching Amityville Horror 2005?
We were watching the movie and I was filming my reactions to it, so that was something that happened.
And where can people see that if they want to?
They can check it out on our Patreon account if they want to see more of my reactions to the entire movie. However, I will be releasing on some of my social media the quick little trailer, my reaction to the trailer of it. But yes, the Amityville Horror film. We decided to watch the 2005 remake, which stars Ryan Reynolds, Melissa George, and a very young and very cute, I must say, Chloe Grace Moretz, who was just adorable as the little girl that talks to dead people. I always love when there's a child that talks to dead people in these movies. The movie is, of course, based on the Amityville horror novel written by Jay Anson. It was a tough call for us given the 1979 original film of the same name, but we decided to go with the 2005 remake because the reviews just kind of were a little bit better for the remake rather than the reviews that were received for the 1979 original. And what's interesting is I mentioned that we would be reviewing this movie for a Halloween double feature at one of the shows that we were at recently, and the women I spoke to immediately gave me a very distinct look and said, yeah, the 1979 movie sucked, is what they told me. So I think we picked right here, Nick. I think it was a good call.
Yeah, I think we made a good call too.
However, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit hesitant because the 2000 remake stars, Ryan Reynolds, who plays almost always Ryan Reynolds.
I think Allison thinks that Ryan Reynolds' acting is the real horror part of this movie.
In the haunted house, yeah. Ryan Reynolds is nice to look at. Okay, I will say that. Ryan Reynolds as a romantic lead, awesome. Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool because he's still playing Ryan Reynolds, great. Ryan Reynolds in Amityville Horror, surprisingly good, but he was shirtless a lot of the time. I don't know if you noticed that, Nick, but it's a horror movie, haunted house, super ghosty, super supposed to be scary, but he was running around with his shirt off like for a good chunk of the film. I mean, he looked good with his shirt off, but I don't know. Can you get rid of ghosts by going around shirtless? Is that a thing?
Yeah, scare the ghosts away by the power of your abs. That's rule 1.
Right, 100 crunches can dispel the demons from a house.
That's why they say exercising the ghost.
Hilarious, Nick. Yeah, so Ryan Reynolds, I'm not a huge fan. I'm very open and vocal about that. And we will review things that we may not be fans of because, let's be real, it's not great to just always review stuff that's awesome. And I went into this movie, I'll be honest, with pretty high expectations because our first spirited pop culture segment was Insidious. And it scared the living daylights out of me.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing you wanted to do for this next segment is you wanted to do something that was actually based in history.
Yeah, it was really neat to do something that was based on a true story because of our Halloween double feature and our next segment being what it's going to be, which I will leave as a surprise until the end of this episode. I wanted to do something that was based on a true story because it would be interesting to see how much overlapped based on the more Hollywood interpretation of the events versus the legit real deal, what may have happened, which we're not talking about in this episode, but stay tuned because we will talk about the true story behind the Amityville Horror situation. But yeah, it was a tough call between the 2005, 1979 versions of this film, but then also the Ryan Reynolds thing. But I feel like Chloe Grace Moretz made up for it as a little girl. She was awesome. Her acting was phenomenal, I feel, in this movie. This movie had mixed reviews itself, with a current average rating of 5.97 out of 10 on Rotten Tomatoes. That's rounding up, that's being generous. And a 6.9 out of 10 on IMDb. If you want to check out those reviews on your own, we've provided links to both websites in the episode description. The movie itself didn't come across as anything stellar compared to the fact that it's a remake of the 1979 film, so a lot of the reviews reflect that fact. A lot of the reviews are comparative of the two films in this franchise, and I believe that there's even more in this franchise. And this is the franchise that confuses me, because we talked about it, I think, in our Insidious episode, where it's like The Conjuring comes up somewhere, and I know that there's been a recent installment where maybe the Amityville Horror franchise has crossed with the Annabelle franchise.
Yeah, if you think the MCU is kind of confusing, stay away from these movies.
Yeah, I know the Marvel Universe, for those of you that aren't hardcore nerds like we are, MCU is the Marvel comic universe, and all the superhero movies that Marvel's come out with recently, which are less confusing to us than this whole Annabelle, Conjuring, Amityville.
Yeah, that whole horror movie timeline, it's enough to drive you to drink.
Is it, Nick? Is it enough to drive you to drink? Spirits, perhaps?
Spirits.
We're just full of the lame jokes tonight. But yeah, I think we're going to have to maybe figure out this whole universe of these movies through us doing these spirited pop culture segments. And I've had some listeners contact me after our first segment that we did about Insidious, begging us to watch the rest of the Insidious franchise because they found it so entertaining, my reactions to some of the stuff that happened. So we may need to do a marathon, Nick, of different forms of the installments of this franchise, but I'll tell you what I'm not looking forward to: Annabelle.
That's a shame, because that's exactly what I'm looking forward to.
I am so creeped out by haunted dolls and haunted children. So Insidious creeps me out for that fact, but Annabelle takes the cake. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do Annabelle, but we'll see. I don't have to worry about that today, because today is about the Amityville Horror movie. And it did all right in the box office, earning $108 million on a budget of $19 million, which is pretty good. Perhaps the coolest detail is the fact that the real Amityville house was used and converted for filming, with the original famous windows installed as part of the movie set. George Lutz, basically the OG Ryan Reynolds that was depicted in this movie, was not really okay with production and didn't receive any opportunity to take part in creating this film, which resulted in some federal court rulings. But any issues Lutz may have had with this movie went to the grave with him, unresolved, after he died in May of 2006. So the fact that the true story tie-in to this whole movie came forward during the production of this is even more scintillating, I feel, in terms of watching the movie. So why did we pick Amityville Horror? Like, why'd we even go there for the next segment? Well, it's based on a true story, as we said, which I thought would be a good pairing for our Halloween special double feature, where we will be following up this episode with our very first ever Paranormal Case Files segment, which I'm super excited for because there may be some channeling of spirit, which we haven't done in an episode yet. So like I said, stay tuned for that. I liked the idea of a classic haunted house film where the house is the enemy or antagonist. And as Nick phrased in our Insidious movie review, it's more like the story revolves around the man versus supernatural trope. Only here, it's an entire family against a house. The story itself is still fairly well known with a lot of people, to the point where the word Amityville almost immediately brings up thoughts about the house. The word Amityville, I feel like, is a household name. I will say we were both confused AF as to which movie we should watch, though, because of the whole multiple universes, installments, crossovers that we were talking about earlier, and somehow maybe the Conjuring franchise and Annabelle and all that stuff. Plus, the movie we chose was a reboot of the original, which was even more confusing. So it took a lot of research just to figure out what movie to watch, and then after that, it was fine. We watched it. But I will say, before we get to what's realistic versus not, and my review of it as a psychic medium, and Nick's review of it as, you know, a bearded hipster entertainment critique person, this movie wasn't frightening to me It wasn't scary at all. Like, the whole time we were watching this movie, I was thinking back to the experience we had with Insidious and how I was blubbering like a baby during the viewing and how we had to stop the film because I had to, like, get my makeup off my face because it was running down my face and looked horrible.
And I had to stop laughing for a few minutes.
Yeah, I know. Believe it or not, Nick was, like, very entertained by what had happened. The whole Amityville Horror movie viewing was, like, not an issue. And I was probably laughing during some of it, actually. I was really not afraid. But usually for me, I'm afraid by a horror movie if it's really realistic. I'm not afraid by a horror movie if it's outlandish. And if it's outlandish, then it's just entertainment to me. So, spoiler alert, that's kind of where this is going because I wasn't that afraid. But let's dive into what was realistic. What was realistic about this film? In the beginning, in the first few, let's say the first 20 minutes of the film, there was a lot of shadow-like apparitions walking through hallways just out of the corner of your eye. That was realistic. Also in the beginning, there were areas of the house that would give you the willies or that people would not want to venture into, including the basement. And we saw that with maybe the real estate agent at the beginning of the film, where she really just kind of went into the foyer and was like, look around for yourselves. Like she wasn't really giving a full-on real estate-y kind of tour through the house, which was odd at the time, but should maybe give you a heads up that this is not the house you should be moving into or purchasing.
Yeah, she was basically like, why don't you just wander around for yourselves, see if this is right for you, and I'll be down here in a safe space.
And it was very much like, I will do you guys a favor by allowing you to have the space and time to talk about this as a loving couple, because I see that you are just such a beautiful family. So why don't I give you the space of the whole house to discuss if this is the house for you? By the way, it's super cheap and I won't tell you why.
Yeah. I'll just be outside stress smoking.
Exactly. I also liked that cold spots in the home were depicted in the beginning of the film and general temperature fluctuations. That's very realistic. Hearing house settling noises or small unexplained creak of floorboards. The smaller moments of imperceptible EVP. For example, in this movie, the EVP, which is electric voice phenomenon, was initially heard by coming through the clock radio and the heating and cooling vents. So those more subtle, nuanced moments were very well done. Again, as in like Insidious, what happened there? A child right off the hop is interacting with a spirit in the home and giving a wild amount of detail to the parent that doesn't necessarily believe it or understand in the beginning. Children in this film are saying specific names or even words they wouldn't normally say. And in this movie, the little girl told her mom that her quote-unquote imaginary friend was calling a quote-unquote bad man an a-hole. Like, things like that kind of really creep me out, because if children come up with words or phrases and we have no idea where they've come from, then something must be happening. For the record, if your child is saying stuff and it's like, WTF, where did that come from? Plus, there is other evidence of haunting type stuff going on that pay attention to the child. In this film, like Insidious, they really didn't pay attention to what the children were saying. But also a very realistic moment was when the little boy in this film was afraid to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and needed a sibling or parent to help them, or ended up peeing in the bed as a result of it. That specifically didn't happen in the movie, but I could see that happening in real life. Even the way the little boy constantly was looking out of the door of the bathroom while doing his business was super realistic. I did a lot of these things myself as a kid, and running to turn the lights on, heck yes, I did that as well when I was a child. Whenever I had to go to the bathroom at night, or I was the last one up in my house at night, I would be running ahead to turn a light on and then running behind to turn the light off from behind me. And then, of course, bathroom door open, all the lights on, blazing, if you had to get up to pee in the middle of the night, because that was terrifying as well. So very realistic how they depicted in the beginning how the children interacted with the spirits or felt about the house. People in the home exhibiting minor changes in attitude and behavior, most notably irritability. So this is the Ryan Reynolds character, the stepfather in the movie, who starts getting a wee bit short with his stepkids in the beginning. That kind of level of irritability is realistic because adults are oftentimes under a lot of pressure in haunted house situations. And in this case, spoiler alert, in this movie, the Ryan Reynolds character is suffering from oppression from spirits trying to really communicate with him and get him to do and say certain things, leading to perhaps possession in this movie. So showing that very nuanced irritability in the beginning and how short he is with children and how it's like, quick to frustration, quick to anger, very realistic. He even went on at some point to experience mild physical illness, cold or flu-like symptoms, or general exhaustion, and that's fairly realistic. He would also feel better physically once out of the house. And it probably creeps people out for me to keep saying that that particular part of it's realistic, but I've dealt with a lot of house cleansing, house clearing situations where people can be physically affected by the energy, and sometimes a certain level of exhaustion or mild physical illness can be depictive of there being kind of spiritual attachment happening within the household.
Have you ever dealt with situations where people are dealing with maybe something supernatural going on in their house and they look for excuses not to go home or to stay out of the house?
Yeah, sure, but it's more so the opposite, weirdly. Like, you would think that if someone was in a super legit haunted house, they would not want to be home all the time. It's almost the opposite, especially if their energy is being drained or they feel physically sick. It's like they end up being stuck in the house. And the idea of leaving the house gives them anxiety. But is it their anxiety that they're feeling, or is it the spirit latching on, wanting them to stay in the house? So logically, yes, Nick, you would think that if someone was feeling ill, they would be living everywhere but at home, couch surfing. We even see this with those reality shows where it's like paranormal investigating's happening, and you almost always ask yourself as a viewer of those programs, why haven't these people left this house yet? And if it's a true legit haunting where people are being physically affected to that degree, sometimes you feel that stuck or you feel that drained that you don't want to leave the house. It creates almost like agoraphobia kind of thing. We also saw a lot of animals reacting to weird paranormal occurrences or people in the home behaving strangely. The dog in this film is barking at what the little girl's doing or barking at what's happening around. Very realistic. There was small haunting type phenomena like toys moving around, plus maybe dining room chairs moving a little bit, or catching a spectral figure or person standing in a window that isn't really there. Also being forwarded to psychiatric or mental health care. So that happened at some point in this film when taking the events of the haunting to a medical professional. That's realistic, although not necessarily a bad thing, as anything relating to mental health should always be ruled out, as well as an extra measure to further validate paranormal experiences. So the fact that the oppression was happening in this movie and we saw a personality shift of Ryan Reynolds' character, which was him depicting George Lutz, I believe?
Yep, George Lutz.
So it was him depicting George Lutz, and he was kind of exhibiting that weird being short with the stepchildren and having that personality changing going on. The fact that he was forwarded to psychiatric mental health care, I'm really glad that they showed that in this film, because that is an integral step. If this was a real deal thing happening, that should occur just in order to rule out. You need to rule out everything to make sure that, is it a haunting? Isn't it a haunting? And then some of the oppressive moments of what a ghost has said to someone is really well finessed and bang on in this movie. So as I said earlier, oppression is when a spirit's really like in your ear trying to convince you of certain things or trying to get you to believe certain things. So some examples in this film that I really liked was when the little girl in this film is told by another little girl spirit that if she basically jumps off of a roof, that she will see her deceased father again and be able to play together in heaven forever. Super creepy, yes, but I loved that moment, weirdly, that that the ghost was trying to convince her of something that was a lie, not true, because it's so realistic, because I've seen and experienced a lot of that as a psychic medium. That scene actually gave me physical chills because the level of dialogue and convincing the spirit must have done could actually happen in real life. In our Ouija board series episode, I think it was the first installment, I mentioned that spirits can lie. Here is a perfect example of it. Who's to say that the spirit of a child is actually manipulative enough to want someone to die? But motivations are always questionable in spirit, and this is played off well in this film with this particular example. At some point, some paranormal phenomena occurs around the same time every night, and in this film it was around 3:15 a.m. That was really realistic. I like how they included the timestamp thing resulting from previous tenants of the house or previous activity in the house. Sometimes paranormal or ghostly events are quote-unquote negative imprints, where they are memories of something that has happened, and those memories steep into the home or physical location. And so that's why, like a skipping record, most things will happen at certain timestamps. This can even happen in terms of you just waking up at a certain time in the middle of the night over and over again. And I've heard from clients that this can even happen at the timestamp of a loved one or someone who has been close to them passing away. So if you find yourself waking up at the same time in the middle of the night, that has meaning and could have meaning in terms of a haunting or a loved one coming to visit or a message in spirit. We saw a lot of interaction between the adults in this film, kind of like Insidious, where one parent or adult residing in the house wanted to leave while another one didn't. But in this case, there was a lot of oppression happening with the character that didn't want to leave. As I said in that Insidious movie review, hauntings can really divide adults or people living in a home. So that was awesome that they threw that in there. I said earlier that minor changes in behavior due to haunting was realistic, but at some point in this film, it shows that the adults suffering from oppression start slamming things around and yelling at people. I'd hate to say that this is realistic, but it can be in extreme cases and circumstances. And the family brings in an outside party. In this case, it was a Catholic priest. And the way the priest conducts himself coming to the house and his initial assessment or walkthrough seemed legit to me. I don't know a lot about that particular field, the more religious Catholic priest kind of side of things, or how they would necessarily do their work, but on surface level kind of first impression, it seemed like he conducted himself in a way that I could appreciate in this film.
No Hot Pockets?
No Hot Pockets were eaten during the filming of this movie. No, I don't know. Maybe Hot Pockets were on set the whole time.
Professionalism as a low bar, people. Just leave the Hot Pockets at home.
Yeah, or eat it in the car before you walk up to the house. How about that? I did like how in the end, when the mother does some research, she finds out that there is an older story that links up to the haunting happening to her family and what happened to the family that resided in the home before her. Although the quote-unquote origin story seemed a bit out there to me, I'm curious to see how much of that matches up to the true story. However, in general, older origin stories like that is fairly realistic in that houses and land can hold energy, and we sometimes have a longer reaching history than we can even remember when sometimes bogged down in our human experience. So there are memories everywhere. Even before a house is erected, there's memories within the land. I like how they tied that into this film, that there was a reason for the haunting or a reason for the behavior that gave the woman in this movie some form of closure in terms of knowing, okay, this is legit, I need to get my family out of here.
If we can go back to the priest for a second, have you ever had any run-ins with clergy or anything like that over like maybe some spiritual activity or hauntings? Or
No, I haven't actually, but I think it's because I don't do a lot of the paranormal investigating type of work, which by the way I would be really interested in getting into. I've always had a passion for paranormal investigating and I would love to do that kind of work, but I think that's why maybe I haven't interacted with clergy or a priest or anything of that nature, which is why I can say that's my surface level opinion based off of what I would feel should be professional for someone who does any form of spirit work, which would include a medium or someone that's more religiously connected to spirit. But yeah, there were moments where what he did wasn't so great, which I'll get to when I start talking about what wasn't realistic in this film, but yeah, I can't really speak a lot to that. I would love, though, if somebody contacted us that does that kind of work within a religious clergy. That would be awesome if we could speak to somebody that does that work so we can kind of compare notes of what's similar and what's different.
Generally, if you were to talk to a Catholic priest, they would say, no, ghosts aren't a thing. We don't believe that in the Catholic Church. However, they do believe that, demons, demon possession, that type of supernatural thing goes on, maybe not quite regularly, but regularly enough that they need dedicated exorcists on staff.
Yeah, fair, true.
But anyway, go on.
So what was not realistic in this film? Well, I hate to say I've got a laundry list, Nick, of what was not realistic in this film. I hope I could get through it quickly. And honestly, at some point, do you remember where I was at some point in the film where I just stopped taking notes? Because I was just like, this is just now so hands in the air. This is now so unrealistic that my fingers on the keyboard cannot keep up with how unrealistic all this is that's happening.
This fictional form of entertainment is bullshit.
Are you calling me out, Nick?
Not at all.
Okay, let's get to it. The full 3D HDTV spectral occurrences, like the little girl standing on the bedpost hanging by a noose, which was one scene. It was so vivid you could almost feel like you could reach out and touch the spectral figure. It may just be a 2005 special effects thing. I can't remember what special effects were like back then. I feel so old right now in this moment saying that. But what's more likely is catching a spectral figure like that out of the corner of your eye, and it's actually ends up being a coat rack or something totally innocuous, and really thinking you're seeing something but definitely not as full on as what that depiction was. And it was in a moment of passion. Do you remember that scene? It was in a moment of passion between the two parents, and he sees this little girl, HD, TV, 3D, full Technicolor, hanging by a noose on the bedpost in the middle of carnal acts. Sorry, I'm laughing because it was hilarious.
Yeah, it's what you call a mood killer.
But I remember you asking me when we were watching that scene, like, does that happen? Do ghosts show up during sex? And I said to you, yeah, but let's not talk about it right now. Because that could be an episode on its own, honestly. But I'm so embarrassed talking about that. But yeah, ghosts are everywhere. So yeah, that does happen. But not as like full on. You could reach out and hold the hand of this dead little girl. That doesn't really happen in that way. So at another point in this movie, and I hate when super duper huge physical things happen. Like that's a huge pet peeve of mine when it comes to horror movies, and especially ghosty horror movies. But at one point, all the windows opened up at once. What would have been more realistic is maybe one window creaking open or even being hard to open or shut. Anything with windows is just kind of not really a thing for me. Like totally, I think in this film it was a windowed in front porch. So there's no walls in the front porch. It's all windows, and they just all spontaneously opened up at the same time. And you see that a lot in movies and TV shows where it's like sometimes kitchen cupboards where they all just spontaneously open up at the same time. No, not a thing. What I'm really afraid of though is if we leave this this recording session and we go into the kitchen and Spirit's like, haha, and all of our kitchen cabinets are opened up. Sometimes I'm afraid to voice things because it's like, be careful what you wish for.
I'm just glad I have an excuse for when I leave one of the cupboards open.
That really is annoying to me. You could blame spirits and I would be less annoyed if it was ghost activity than my spouse just leaving kitchen cabinets open all the time.
Ghosts will be ghosts, but Nick, he needs to be punished.
Yeah, pretty much. There was a fully padlocked door, and all of a sudden the padlock was off, and the keys were found with someone else in the house who didn't do it. That whole scene confused me. What was it? I think it was a boathouse that was padlocked because Ryan Reynolds was kind of going off the deep end at that point. He's now forever just Ryan Reynolds to me in this movie. Like, I can't even remember the character's name. It's Ryan Reynolds. So Ryan Reynolds was freaking out. I know I'm ridiculous. Ryan Reynolds was freaking out that the kids are playing in the boathouse, or like the dog won't stop barking at the boathouse. He was freaking out about something, and he was always freaking out in this movie. So he decided to padlock it, but then all of a sudden the padlock was off, and it was, I guess, the quote unquote black sheep bad kid in the house was found with the key, and it was just this whole big thing. That's not realistic. Like, ghosts don't really will remove a lock from something and then place the lock somewhere random and put the keys. Like, are they manipulative in the sense that they would think of something like that? Yeah. Do they have the physical power on the earth plane to be able to see those kind of things through? No. So that was really very much not realistic to me. Also similar to the scene where the alphabet letters moving on the fridge spelled out a full-on threatening phrase, and in this movie it was catch 'em, kill 'em, catch 'em with a K, because that was part of the whole backstory. What would have been more realistic is thinking you see this happen and immediately being aware that what you're seeing isn't actually there. That feeling of being mistaken. That big sigh is really because, I'm sick of the whole alphabet letters moving around. It could have been soup with the noodle letters spelling out a threatening phrase, but it's still soup.
What would have been more realistic is if she ran to show someone, and then when they came back, it was just
it was exactly how it was before, and she was mistaken. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That feeling of being mistaken and there being physical evidence that never really happened. But they showed it as in, they showed the actual letters slowly moving, Nick, which for me was a problem. It should have been, she glances at the fridge, gets something out of the fridge to make dinner for her children and her going crazy husband at this point, Ryan Reynolds. And she turns back to stir the wooden spoon in the pot on the stove. And then she goes back to the fridge because, ooh, I forgot the parsley. And the letters are catch 'em, kill 'em. And then she's like, WTF? And she looks around all panicked. And then she looks back at the fridge and it looks like nothing's happened. super realistic if that's what's happened, but she saw the letters moving, which bothered me because that makes it over the top at that point. We also saw a lot of doors slamming, closed, and locking themselves spontaneously. It's like the window thing all over again for me. By the way, Nick does leave doors open in the house or closed or lights on or off. It's not spirit activity, but that bothers me. Not you necessarily doing it, but showing like ghosts doing stuff like that. There were an awful lot of scenes in this movie with blood dripping from everything. Light bulbs, light switches, faucets, over hands. I don't know why the blood dripping everywhere is a thing in paranormal, ghost, haunted house, horror films. Like, can we put out a memo to Hollywood that they just stop using that trope? Because it is so far beyond unrealistic.
And honestly, it's almost 2020. You can do better, Hollywood.
Yeah, like come up with more psychological thrills and chills and, go back to the insidious formula of making a movie where they don't see all the creepy stuff happening, but the audience sees it and it creates those jump scare kind of moments. That would be more realistic for me. The blood thing does not need to happen at all. There was a ghost grabbing someone to put their hand into their own death wound. Oh yeah, I remember the scene.
Oh, the babysitter with the little girl?
The babysitter locked in the closet. Why did she even go into the closet? I forget. And then the little girl comes and the little girl's got gunshot wound in her forehead. And the spectral figure, Nick, believe it or not, can physically grab the hand of this living person and pull it towards her gunshot wound and put the finger in the gunshot wound. Like, for real? I can't even with that one. And it was a little girl ghost to boot, which is just even more bizarre to me. A ghost grabbing you is just a no. And then forcing your hand into their wound is a mega no. But it being a little girl ghost who is sweet in some scenes and then like forcibly putting people's hands in her gunshot wound. Like, I feel like the movie went off the rails at that point, to be honest. Okay, so we had talked a little bit about Ryan Reynolds and his oppression and I guess ripping his shirt off and running around shirtless for a lot of this movie. Nick, the look on your face is priceless. So the ripping of the shirt off canon in my head is part of the whole being possessed by the ghostly figures. Okay. So the shirt being ripped off at this point for me is basically canon in my head of him being oppressed by the ghostly spectral figures. But the level to which he gets belligerent and hateful is beyond for me at some point. Like, it's well done to a point, but then after the beginning, when it's small irksome behavior, which is more realistic, he begins to just legit yell at the kids all the time, and he yells not so kind things at the children about their deceased father. That's not really so much realistic to me, because the oppression was done in a little bit more subtle, subconscious kind of way. I didn't really feel like the degree of the dramatic behavior was typical for most cases of oppression. So him going off the rails like that, although I just keep going back in my head to the fact that him ripping his shirt off is now like, that's oppression. If your husband, your father, guys listening, if your husband, your father is ripping his shirt off in the middle of the house, your house may be haunted.
Also known as pulling a Captain Kirk.
Oh, is that another nerd reference?
Mm-hmm.
See, I don't even get that nerd reference. That's how deep nerdy that nerd reference is.
Well, yeah, it was like Captain Kirk is always ripping his shirt or taking it off for no good reason, so.
Isn't there someone else that does that? I think I'm thinking of Matthew McConaughey, who like literally is always like no shoes, no shirt,
Absolutely.
No McConaughey in every single movie that he's in.
I actually saw him on Between Two Ferns, and the guy says, "Matthew, I see you're wearing a shirt. Is everything okay?"
And what did he say? F off.
Something like that.
Oh, there's another moment in this movie where someone's grabbed by ghostly arms and violently pulled underwater. Anything where a ghost is physically touching you is not realistic. What would have been more realistic is feeling like you're being watched in the shower, thinking you see something out of the corner of your eye while taking a bath, feeling cold air on you, the temperature fluctuations. Not necessarily the water itself, but feeling cold and still warm in a shower, that's realistic. But being physically pulled underwater and drowning and like arms are around you, no, definitely not realistic. A child or anyone else physically appearing or climbing up to a roof of a house, oh, this scene. remember this scene, right?
Yes.
Where I had said earlier that the little girl spirit talking to the little girl in the house about jump off the roof because you'll reunite with daddy and be able to play with him in forever and in heaven. And how I said that I loved that scene weirdly because I'm strange. The fact that the child actually found her way onto the roof doesn't actually make logical sense in this movie because she was, I guess in this movie, supposed to have been led by the ghost to the roof of the house. I don't think so.
Honestly, I think the only reason they did this is the complete absurdity of it hooking the audience.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But like even visually, like how they depicted this house, how they visually showed the Amityville house, based on the pitch of the roof and how slippery the shingles are, I just can't see how the little girl got there. Like, we panned to the little girl, I guess, going out of the window, and then we all of a sudden panned back after the parents are running around panicked like they can't find this little girl for the life of them, and she's on the pitch of the roof about to take a swan dive. They didn't even show how she scrambled up there.
Yeah, the big parkour moment of the movie. They didn't show that.
Can you imagine this little girl doing hardcore parkour on this roof? Maybe she was possessed. Maybe the ghost went inside of her little girl body, Nick, and did the parkour for her to get to the roof. I don't know. It just doesn't seem realistic.
Now that's a movie I'd want to see.
I'm pretty sure that's in one of those Scary Movie films.
Yeah.
Literally called Scary Movie because they do that outlandish stuff instead of these actual horror films. But being led to believe that this is something you should do, but not actually physically doing it is probably more realistic. Even having a vision of yourself doing it while awake or in a dream would be more likely, but this actually physically happening, not very likely at all. So there was also a lot of alluding to, I can't remember if this was shown or if this was alluded to, but there was some alluding to the killing of animals or people while possessed. And I believe this was like the dog, right? The family dog that was the only character in the film that knew this is not a good house to be in. And the lovable family dog that tried to protect the children and protect everyone else in this house was offed by Ryan Reynolds at some point. Or it was implied that he was offed by Ryan Reynolds.
Yeah, I didn't get that, but that makes sense.
What would have been more realistic is perhaps verbally threatening or making others very physically uncomfortable, but I feel most possessions are more harmful to the person being possessed than the people around them. Although this can legit be psychologically harmful to people around them, so it depends on the type of harm that you're talking about, but like I think we're then in psychotic, sociopathic territory. If killing of animals is happening, I don't know that you can just blame possession for that. Dun dun dun.
Yeah, if you kill animals for fun or entertainment, that's on you folks.
Yeah, I love how you just say it so cavalier. Nick, don't give our listeners the wrong impression. You're actually just this big teddy bear cuddly guy. This is the scene that you love, Nick, but a doll or toy showing up that was buried with a previous tenant. You actually legit loved when this happened. Like, you had a smile on your face during this scene. I remember this. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to be the buster of dreams, Nick, but that's not realistic.
No.
I know, I'm so sorry. What would have been more realistic is finding an object in the home left by previous tenants, which also happened in this movie, but more so with electronics, like the clock radio and then the old TV set. But a doll or a toy spontaneously showing up that was actually buried with the previous tenant, and all of a sudden the little girl in this movie has that same doll in her arms. Like I said, ghosts can't do physical stuff like that. Like, dig up a doll that was buried with somebody else, unless the person in this movie was mistaken that the doll, that would make it more realistic if the person was mistaken that the doll was actually buried with the first little girl. So when the priest comes to town, when the priest comes into the house, there is a very end of times, end of days moment where there's a whole host of flies showing up out of an air vent. Like, there were thousands of them. It looked like the coming of locust, aka sign of the apocalypse, going down. What would have been more realistic is maybe finding bugs. I'm sorry to say, folks, finding bugs is a haunted house thing, because oftentimes little creepy crawly critters will be attracted to that kind of activity. So finding bugs, flies, and mice in a super duper haunted house is somewhat realistic, but it would be the kind of activity or occurrences might spike a little bit in a haunted house. It wouldn't necessarily be a full-on assault of the flies coming forward out of the vent. That was a little bit much. The third party brought in to cleanse and clear the house, the priest ends up running away from the house and basically basically leaving the family to fend for themselves. So up until this point, I've been saying I don't know enough about a priest doing a house cleansing, clearing, or whatever it is that they choose to call it, to be able to critique what it is the priest did in this film. But him running away and being like, Lates, you're on your own, family. And then he's not seen for the rest of the film. He just runs away and he's like, he's outie, he's gone. It's done. I'd like to think that a priest wouldn't do this. And if they were that frightened, one of their top priorities would be getting the family to safety ASAP. In this case, I'd just like to believe in the best case scenario for humanity and all spirit workers, including those of specific religious doctrines. So I'm going to say this wasn't realistic, him running away in terror.
Yeah, usually if you've ever met any clergy, they're generally some sort of tough. They're made of sterner stuff usually. I don't know. How would you say that?
Yeah, I would say any form of spirit religious worker is maybe a little bit more tough as nails. I know that if it was me in this situation, because I can't speak to someone else, I can only speak to myself. Haha, I speak to myself all the time. Anyway, if it was me in this situation, if I was that much in terror or horror of something that was going on in the house of a client, I would tell them, you know what, I don't even feel safe with you being here. Like, I don't know that I can leave without calling 911 or without escalating this to you guys should not be physically in this house. And the only example I can think of for this is, it hasn't happened with a house cleansing or clearing for me, but it has happened where somebody I'm speaking to is naturally gifted and receiving and connecting to spirits all the time, but that leads to depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, all that kind of stuff. I will sometimes be blunt and tell people, like, you know, I'm not okay ending a session, or I'm not okay walking away without this being escalated to a next step. So like 911 should be called, or suicide hotline, critical care, what have you, should be called. But yeah, I don't think if I was in this situation, I would have walked away. I don't think so. That's why for me, this wasn't realistic. And then, like I said, when we started this whole what's realistic, what's not, the whole ending of the film, like the last 20 to 30 minutes were just so not realistic to the extreme. Like screws drilling themselves in further, windows locking themselves and refusing to open, basically anything ridiculous that would keep a family inside of a house, because at the last point of this film, it's the house against the family, the supernatural against man kind of trope thing going on. There would just be too many things to list, so I have to just chalk it up. The last 20 to 30 minutes of this film just was completely unrealistic. I can't even be bothered to break it down, the individual events. Like I said earlier, at some point I was just like, hands in the air. Nick, this is just so beyond at this point. I can't even individually pick out everything.
Well, I feel bad for you because this movie is really toned down from the book in terms of the last little ending bit.
Is it seriously?
It's toned down quite a bit.
No, Nick, don't tell me that. Yeah, so by the way, Nick read the Amityville Horror book as research for our next segment that's coming up, and we will talk about it a little bit in the next segment. But the fact that you're telling me that the book was even more than this, I don't know how to feel about this. Moving along. Things that might happen, but it's not likely. So I only have 2 things on this list. Things where it's like, I couldn't say that it would happen. I also couldn't be pressed to say that it wouldn't happen. So I'm floating it out there to you, dear listeners, to see if you guys think it would be realistic or not. There was a full-on trance-like moment for the little girl in this film at some point where she put herself in a dangerous, precarious position and it spooked the parents out. I haven't encountered it. That's that roof scene where she's up on the roof and she finds herself there. Apparently she was in a trance getting up to the roof. I haven't seen it. Do children go into strange, unresponsive trances in real life spiritual occurrences? I don't know. This was also maybe depicted in Insidious though, and I had put it in the I don't know category. So if somebody out there has had an experience like this, you're more than welcome to write into the show and share that experience. I may even channel on it a little bit for you if there's any unresolved lack of closure or needing a validation or verification about this, but I just haven't seen it, so I can't say whether it's real or not. The second thing that kind of put me off a little bit was how extreme the physical illness got to, where it extended to the point of physically throwing up and being very, very physically ill. So I had said earlier, having like exhaustion, lethargy, dizziness, nausea, that kind of stuff. Sure, that seems realistic to me in a very super duper haunted house and situation where someone in the home is having an oppressive relationship with a spirit or entity. But they showed Ryan Reynolds as very severely physically sick in this film. So like maybe, I don't know, tell me if you know of an instance where this has happened, or again, write into the show if you have been affected so much from a haunted house that you've been physically ill, because we'd love to hear about it. We always want to learn new things.
And where can they send their emails to?
Right, if you want to share with us some of your creepy crawly ghost stories, or if you've had experiences that reflect some of what we've talked about in this episode, email us at spiritunpluggedpodcast@gmail.com and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, anything that you send in, if you send us in your stories, we may actually do an entire episode, a mailbag episode of everything you guys send in. So please send us your creepy ghost stories, your questions, anything that you send in, we'll probably read.
Yeah, I actually want to do an episode like that before the end of 2019, so I'm going to put it out there. Email us your stuff. Definitely email us your stuff, because we have some ghost stories from people who have submitted, and we plan on doing a mixed bag, mailbag kind of episode before we end 2019, our first year of podcasting, so email us the stuff. Again, spiritunpluggedpodcast@gmail.com. So all in all, what is my professional psychic medium take on this movie, the Amityville Horror, filmed in 2005 with starring Ryan Reynolds? I'm going to assess this movie now on my own scale of paranormal accuracy, and I'd say it's the only scale where maxing out boos, getting 5 boos out of 5, is a good thing. The movie started off with smaller, more nuanced haunting and ghostly behavior, which for me was more in line with how it actually happens in real life. Unfortunately, all depictions of the ghosts themselves, save for the shadow scene at the beginning or implied at rare points, were completely unrealistic, to the point that this movie wasn't even that scary to me, because it was like seeing children playing dress up. Even a lot of the behavior of the people in the house, with the elements of possession implied, which I stand by as more like oppression than possession, were completely outlandish. Like the entire scene in the boathouse at the end, where the possessed father figure Ryan Reynolds manipulates the propeller of the speedboat to somehow capture the hair of the wife and then drop the motor to drown her, only to come out of his stupor and realize what he was doing, then have the wherewithal to reverse all of those super complex actions. If you're confused, I'm confused. It was just all very confusing. In the last 20 to 30 minutes of this film, I was just left gobsmacked by how over-the-top ridiculous a lot of it was. I really wanted to enjoy the crescendo of this movie, but that was hard to do with the fact that a lot of things were convenient, like the raging storm outside and mud everywhere when the family is trying to leave and the wife is trying to save Ryan Reynolds. The only positive thing I can say about this movie is that it did intrigue me and make me want to research the true stories of the Amityville haunting that it's based off of, mostly because so many things were way unrealistic that I was thirsting to know more about the documented accounts associated with this true story. So overall, I have to say for paranormal accuracy, Amityville Horror gets 1 out of 5 boos for me. I know it's not a great score. And this is mostly because this movie left me even more impressed with the haunting elements of the movie Insidious. And if I could, I would have given that movie 4 out of 5 boos for the hauntings, as I said in that review, but it was more so the out-of-body experiences and astral projection that didn't allow me to give it full 4 out of 5 boos. But yeah, 1 out of 5 boos for Amityville Horror. It just didn't stack up for me. And maybe it would have gotten a higher rating, Nick, if I hadn't seen Insidious first, but I kept comparing it to Insidious. Now we're going to hear a little bit of Nick's take on the entertainment value of this movie. His thoughts and feelings on what was good, what was not so great.
All right. My take on Amityville Horror. One thing I really liked about this movie is it did start out pretty fast. It didn't have that long, drawn-out beginning where you're just waiting for the action to happen. But from that point, it never seemed to go to a low, or it was just always riding high, jump scare after jump scare, creepy moment after creepy moment. And when I watch a horror movie, I'd like to see a little up and down. So when it actually goes to that jump scare or creepy moment, it's that much more shocking.
Yeah, you like for there to be a cooling off period.
Yeah.
So that you can like build up the momentum and build up the scare and build up the anticipation. And that, I think, if I remember correctly, that's something you really liked about Insidious, was that it had a lot of those lull moments that really build up through the music and the cinematography, all the scary things happening. But this was just kind of like...
Yeah, it was just all at 11 and never came down. And
this was one of those roller coaster rides where there's not that, you know, uphill buildup and then you're flying. It was like you're just moving fast the entire time. I agree with you about that one.
And one thing that just drove me up the wall is the little girl apparently Spider-Manning on top of the roof and doing her little balancing act. That seemed a little dumb. I get that this is like fantasy and not everything has to be super realistic, but there's a lot of things you could do with that would build a little more suspense.
I think you also mentioned too that you just don't think children are that gullible. Even when it comes to spirit activity, this little girl in this film is 8 years old, and you just legitimately didn't feel that she was gullible enough to be Spider-Man'd up onto the roof.
Yeah, like it just didn't make sense. And not that things have to make sense in a movie, but I'm going to leave it at that. Personally, I prefer a little more psychological stuff as well. One thing that Allison didn't talk about was Ketchum. What was his name?
I don't know, the Ketchum guy in this movie that was supposed to be part of the origin story of why the house was haunted. It's like there was this scene where Ryan Reynolds tore down a wall in the basement and went into this like dank, deep dungeon of sorts.
The secret torture room from the 1700s.
Yeah.
There's a lot that could have been done with that. You could have explored that a little more. But instead it turned Ryan Reynolds into an axe murderer. It just seemed like you could have done a little more with that. There would have been a little more room for the creepy, oh my god, that's so genius moment.
Yeah, you prefer, I think, when characters reveal certain scary events through dialogue instead of just being shown on TV or on the film. So you prefer when it's alluded to.
Yeah.
So they could have alluded to that Ryan Reynolds had this big epic date in the middle of the night, shirtless, with Ketchum in the basement. I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm turning it ridiculous, but they could have alluded to that like clandestine midnight affair date moment with Ketchum happening instead of actually showing it. And it probably would have been more effective in terms of the psychological thriller aspect. I know you're laughing at me right now.
This sounds like fan fiction that you should be like jotting down.
I think maybe I've just created a new subgenre of Amityville fan fiction, actually. Horror fan fiction. I can't.
But seriously, like a lot more could have been done there. You could have done things a little more subtly, only they decided to turn around and just have Ryan Reynolds run around with his shirt off with an axe.
Yeah, that was the last like 30 minutes of the movie that I was done. I closed my laptop, I closed up shop and was like, I guess I'm watching this for entertainment only for the last little bit of the movie.
A lot of jump scares in the movie, a lot of like tiny little things were things that the main characters couldn't see. So it was kind of like, why even show them?
Yeah, like, the characters didn't even get vibes that there was something happening. Like, it's, when we talked earlier about that Nick prefers when something's revealed through dialogue or something is like the audience sees it but the character doesn't. How something like that is effective is if the character gets those weird vibes or the willies, or we see that the character is like a little off balance. But here they did it where when those moments did happen, the character was just like in La La Land and had no idea anything was happening. So it wasn't psychologically effective.
Yeah, they were just pretty much going on with their normal life, and there was this thing that was completely removed off to the side. It just seemed pointless.
Yeah, it felt like two different movies, I think, at that point.
One thing I did not like about this movie, the sound was not the greatest. Unlike Insidious, which I gave 5 out of 5 beards. I didn't like the way they refused to use certain sound. Like, they could have done a lot more with the sound to make it a little more psychologically intense.
Triggering, yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't. They just relied on, these cheap people in makeup wandering around that the characters couldn't see.
I think if I had to put my finger on it, what we're both struggling to communicate is they relied on too much gore for a haunted house movie.
Exactly.
There was too much of, like, that scene where the babysitter's hand is going into the bullet wound of the child, and they relied too much on the gore aspect, which works in horror movies and can totally work in other paranormal, supernatural horror movies. But when it's more of like a ghost horror movie, like, the gore doesn't really have space for that because the whole frightening part of the ghost is that it's intangible.
Yeah.
So then to force it to be tangible makes it more kitschy, funny than spooky, scary.
Now, like, if it was a cool visual seeing the finger go into the bullet hole, but...
Right, but if that had been a dream sequence, would have been way more effective.
Definitely. One thing I did like was they actually threw in a little bit of comedy or a little bit of... They poked fun of the absurdity of certain aspects of the movie, like the really, really bad babysitter.
Do you think that really was intentional, though?
I think so, because she actually came out and said, man, I suck at babysitting, and then she started smoking a joint and eating their food.
Okay, fair. Like, that may have been on purpose, you're right.
Yeah.
But if the whole movie had been that, this would be a very different review from both of us, maybe.
Probably.
Because if the whole movie had done that and they did that well in that moment, this movie would have gone over, I think, a lot better. But it was a movie that was trying to be a serious horror film, quote unquote, with the whole haunted house aspect based on a true story. If they had added that element of comedy a little bit more, like, and it was a dark comedy, kind of horror comedy vibe, yeah, maybe. Because you're right, that scene was the scene with the babysitter in the closet. The reason why we remember that scene with that girl pulling that babysitter's hands into her gunshot wound is because we were both laughing, howling the whole time. It was hilarious.
It was hilarious.
So if the whole movie was that, you would maybe have a very different review for...
I probably would, because at least it would be still... it would still be more entertaining.
Yes.
It wouldn't be that realistic, but...
It wouldn't be boring to you.
Another part I did like was when the little kid walked in at the beginning of the movie and there's Ryan Reynolds and his mom starting to get busy, and the kid walks in and says, George, what are you doing to my mom? Nothing, buddy. I thought that was kind of funny.
They just continued after the kid left anyway. We're laughing, but we're not parents. That might be something legit parents have to do just to be able to have that intimacy. Is like, shrug, back to it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So I give this movie 2 out of 5 beards. It's not a one beard movie, so I guess that's something. But yeah, there you go.
Why is it a beard rating system, Nick?
Because beards are awesome and my beard is epic.
Also, you're a hipster.
Yes.
Well, all in all, I guess you could say that this was a very entertaining experience in that it wasn't very realistic, this movie, and you didn't necessarily find this movie to stack up against Insidious, much like I didn't see it really stack up against Insidious. But like I said earlier, I am very curious to know more about the true story. That's all that this movie sparked for me, is like, I now must know how much of what was mentioned in the film was claimed or on record for the true story and how much wasn't, and how does the book that you read, Nick, stack up against this film. But we're going to get into that with our next segment, part of our double feature for our special Halloween double feature, where our next segment is going to be all about our first ever foray into Paranormal Case Files, where we take a look at the actual true story elements of the Amityville haunting. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to this segment. We love you as always. Let us know if you enjoy our spirited pop culture movie reviews, and if there is a particular movie that you want us to review that highlights paranormal, spiritual, or supernatural topics, then please email us your suggestions to spiritunpluggedpodcast@gmail.com, because we do this for you guys. So if there's something that you want us to watch, if there's something that you want me to be super creeped out, spooked out, have insomnia, can't sleep for the rest of the night because it's so realistic, or if there's something that you want us to laugh about, or maybe Ryan Reynolds is in another horror movie, please don't do that to me. Unless he's shirtless.
In Allison's opinion, all Ryan Reynolds movies are horror movies.
But a bunch. But yeah, if there's anything that you want us to watch, then email us. And keep listening to catch, like I said, our second part of this very special Halloween double feature, because we're about to get into the true story of the Amityville haunting.
Thank you for listening to us on Spirit Unplugged. If you have questions about our content, guests, or future episode requests, email us at spiritunpluggedpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple iTunes or Google Play. And join us next time when you need to unplug.